Hello everyone, in today's video I install the steering system into the Firebird and I make a bit more progress on the Skyline project. So the first thing I wanted to do on the Firebird was finish up the wiring. I believe it was a couple of weeks ago that I chose all the electronic components that I'll be using and began wiring the ESC. Now I was ready to add a connector for the battery and wire in the servo. I started by cutting all the wires that I'll be using and I soldered the battery connector onto the ESC. In order for the receiver to fit where I wanted to mount it on the chassis, I needed to trim down the pins. I will also solder the wires directly onto the pins. I needed to extend the length of the wires on the servo in order for them to reach the receiver. Using a smaller gauge wire would have been ideal, but this was the smallest I had on hand. After everything had been connected, I once again did a quick test to make sure everything is functioning as it should. It's not the cleanest setup in the world, but it'll get the job done. Next, I wanted to move on to the front suspension and steering. I started by sanding the front wheel hubs, and I used a bit of Model Master steel paint to make them look a bit like brake rotors. Next, I wanted to figure out how I was going to make the steering system. I started by positioning the steering servo in different areas around the front to figure out exactly where I wanted to place it. The steering servo is quite large in relation to the car, however I figured out a way to fit it in so that only some very minor modifications to the chassis will be necessary. Since the motor sits quite low, I will need to have it sit fairly far back in the car in order to have enough room for the steering linkage, which shouldn't be a problem. After brainstorming some designs, I came up with this simple piece that will easily mount to the chassis and has a mount for the servo and idler arm. The piece sits great on the front of the car, and only some minor modifications to the chassis and body are needed for it to fit. I cut some small pieces off of the chassis where the sway bar would mount on a full-size car and sanded the surface smooth. Earlier when mocking up the front suspension, I noticed that I was getting a bit of negative caster angle, which is certainly not desirable, especially on a drift car. To fix this, I modified the design of the steering knuckle so that the lower strut mount is placed closer to the front of the vehicle, which gives the car a bit of positive caster angle. I can also modify the position of the upper strut support to adjust the caster angle as well. I'm going with a linkage steering system, similar in design to how the full-scale steering system looks. The first thing I did was mount the idler arm and pitman arm to the center link. Once installed, I mounted each tie rod end to the steering knuckles. I also glued the magnets to the front wheel hubs and front wheels. After gluing the magnets, I wanted to mount the hubs to the knuckle by first installing the bearing and then a screw and washer that holds the hub in place. In hindsight, this would have been a bit easier to do before I mounted the K-member to the chassis, but everything went on without too much trouble. I also installed the springs. After doing a little bit of sanding to the servo mount to accommodate for the slight angle of the chassis, I glued the mount in place and connected the idler arm. Next, I installed the servo. I just glued the pitman arm to the servo since the splines were very worn. With all the steering components installed, I did a quick test to make sure everything was functioning as it should. And finally, I went ahead and glued the receiver to the chassis. With the steering installed and everything wired, the only major thing left to do before taking this car for a test drive is to install the motor and drivetrain. Nearly all of those components have been printed, and it's just a matter of getting them installed. Last week I made quite a bit of progress on the Skyline build, including some bodywork, designing the wheels, and building a rear diffuser. I'm very pleased with the wheels' design and how they turned out, however I wanted to reprint them to be a bit larger. Like on the Firebird, I once again used some Model Master steel paint to paint the brake rotors. I will also be painting the wheels as well, probably either flat black or satin black. I really like how the larger wheels and slightly lower profile tires look on this car. I'm also really liking how the rear diffuser is looking. I wanted to do just a bit more sanding and filing to smooth out certain sections before I paint it. I also did a bit more sanding on the tailpipe piece to smooth it out as well. Next, I wanted to make a front splitter for this car. The process for doing this is even simpler than the rear diffuser. I started by tracing the base of the bumper onto a flat piece of styrene, and then I drew out from there how large I wanted to make the splitter. I then cut the piece and sanded it so that the edge was smooth and each side was symmetrical. Just doing this made for a nice looking splitter, but I wanted to do another layer to make it look a bit more interesting. I repeated the same process, but this time I didn't want the piece to extend beyond the front of the bumper. Once the shape matched up well with the bumper, I cut out a section of the center to create a slot. used Chugu to glue the top part of the splitter in place since it is slow drying. That way I can make some adjustments so that it fits well up against the bumper. I still want to do a bit of sanding, but I'm already liking how it looks. I was able to make a little bit of progress on the chassis that I'll be using for the Skyline build. This is a custom designed, shaft-driven, all-wheel drive chassis. It's got a very conventional layout and a simple suspension design with fixed upper and lower supports, with the spring seated on the top of the knuckle, allowing the knuckle to slide up and down, which I'll demonstrate in just a bit. I began by installing the steering linkage mount to the chassis and installing the steering servo as well. I'm still waiting on a few parts I need to arrive in the mail before I can fully assemble the chassis, but I wanted to go ahead and mock up the front suspension so I can demonstrate how it works. As you can see, the knuckle simply sits between two fixed pieces and it can slide up and down. I'm not quite sure what the name for this type of suspension is, but I've seen it used on a lot of cheaper toy-grade RC cars, especially smaller scale ones, and I think the original Mini Zs had something similar as well. Obviously, this setup doesn't allow for the caster or camber to be adjusted. However, some simple design modifications can be made to allow for more adjustability, such as replacing the upper and lower bushings with ball joints that still let the knuckle slide up and down, but their position can be adjusted by positioning the upper or lower mount. I'm sure I'll be building more variations of this chassis in the future with different setups like I described, but for all-wheel drive drifting, this chassis will do just fine even in its current non-adjustable setup. Before concluding this video, I want to showcase some of the awesome work you guys have been showcasing in the Make It RC Facebook group. It's been a lot of fun seeing all the great vehicles you all have built and are in the process of completing. Certainly some amazing, very unique vehicles, a lot of scratch building, and some awesome modifications. If you're interested in joining, I'll have a link to the Make It RC Facebook page below. It's just meant to be a casual place to showcase and discuss anything RC related, model building, 3D printing, or any other similar topics. And that is all for today's video. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.